morning, everyone, and thank you for waking up with me today on Up with India. I'll be joined by former FBI Special Agent Frank Burton to discuss Delaware's Law Enforcement Accountability Subcommittee and the focus of the task force that has been created by the Delaware General Assembly in response to the nation's ongoing fight with police brutality and systemic racism. Joining me now on the show, Mr. Frank Burton. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, India, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. For those that don't know who you are, give me a quick introduction for our viewers so that we can just get warmed up.
For the purposes of this interview, I am a 22 and a half year retired special agent with the FBI. Spent a lot of time in the Philadelphia division as a hostage negotiator and a civil rights expert.
Hmm. Why did you decide to join law enforcement?
Wow, that's part of the conversation today. As a kid, I never wanted to be part of law enforcement. Most of my interactions with law enforcement were kind of brutal. I wasn't a kid that got in trouble, but I was the one to find myself with the face on the pavement and a shotgun at the back of my head, only to find out that I looked like somebody described as a subject that the police would later on let me go. Um, I had a lot of interactions with law enforcement like this growing up. Like I said, I never got in trouble. I was an athlete. I went on to college, but these were some of the influences that made me not want to be in law enforcement. After I graduated college, I started working at a bank, and I met ex Secret Service agent who asked me if I ever wanted to get in law enforcement. And he told me a few things about the Secret Service, and I said, "Look," his name was Bill Redunda. I said, "Bill, listen," and it's senior, not the junior, not the lawyer. I said, "Look, Bill," I said, "I'm from the hood." I said, "All I know about the Secret Service is we're walking down the street, the president's there, they start shooting, you jump out." I said, "No, I don't want to be in the Secret Service." He said, "No, but you really should think about it." He said, "You are very articulate, you pay close attention to detail. Just think about it." A few years later, the FBI came in doing some testing. I went down to take the test, and the rest is history.
Hmm. So, one of your first encounters with law enforcement was actually a case of your civil rights being violated. You actually weren't the suspect that they were looking for, but you ended up in that situation. Wow. When you see and witness what is happening right now in the media with people's civil rights being what could be described as violated, what does that mean to you, to the young man that was once in a position where something terrible could have happened in that situation? What does that mean to you?
Well, to me, as a young man, it means it shows why historically, and when you go back in law enforcement, you got to think about even on this committee, people are asking, and people ask often, well, how come it's so hard for blacks and especially black males to get involved in law enforcement? How come we can't find good candidates? How come nobody's interested, black males, black females, in law enforcement? Well, we got to go back to the history. Back in the 1700s, law enforcement was developed to capture slaves, and that's the first organized law enforcement. Later on, 100 years later, in the 1800s, up in the north, that was in the south. Up in the north, the first funded law enforcement agency was used to not capture, but to make sure that they would be able to um, have a grasp on all the immigrants, control the immigrants coming in. So law enforcement historically is capture and control. And sadly to say, that brand of law enforcement, that narrative has never changed.
Hmm.
So it's hard for us as African Americans to get excited about being in law enforcement because the mentality is still there. And we got to break through a lot of different things just to be part of law enforcement.
So, knowing all that you know about that, why would you still then decide to join?
Because there's a thing that I believe in, is called hope. And the hope is that if I, instead of going to the barbershop, instead of you and I sitting out on the street corner talking about how bad things are and how terrible it is, how about getting an opportunity to get on the inside, to try to make a change, to try to be a change? And my whole goal was to try to get on the inside to try to be a change. And people, I'm from the north side, Wilmington, I'm from Chester, Pennsylvania originally. And people will say, well, man, why you go into the FBI? Why you go? You're an op. Why did you do that? Well, I got in the FBI. By the time I left the FBI, I was the voice of the Philadelphia division. I was the media representative, primary media representative. I was a civil rights expert, which we're talking, right? Um, I was a hostage negotiator. So while I was, you get that from the city too. Man, you can't, drugs are coming in. We're not bringing drugs in. You can't stop that. Well, I wasn't the end all and be all, but I did make a change. And that was
Mhm.
the thing. So some other young black male, black female, Hispanic male, Hispanic female coming up might have hope that it might be something that they might want to do as well.
Do you go through a separation of thoughts and feelings when you consider civil rights injustices and police brutality because you were a former law enforcement officer?
Yeah, in reality, yes, absolutely. But in order to be effective, what you have to do, and I've said this before, I've learned how to pass the truth of my experience, going through all those things without passing on the prejudice of my experience. So in order to be effective, if I held all the prejudice that has ever happened, because India is still happening to me today. I'm 57-year old. I'm a big dude. I was just down at Ocean City a couple weeks ago with my wife. We walk into the Salisbury Mall. She's shopping. All of a sudden, I'm with her, and then I go away from her maybe around 5, 7 minutes. And when I come back to her, she looks at me and she says, "Are you finished playing peekaboo?" And I said, "Peekaboo." I said, "I'm not hiding from you." She said, "I know." She said, "Are they doing that again?" So I still get profiled. I still get followed. I follow world terrorists for a living. So I know when I'm being followed. So what I do is I play a little game with them, and then I'll tap them on the shoulder and I'll pull out my credentials and say, "Are you following me?" I said, "No." I say, "I see all your cameras. Tell all your boys to back off. I'm not here to steal anything." So I still get profiled to this day. I still get profiled when I
How does
go
that
into
make
stores.
you feel?
It makes me feel bad, but here's the thing: with us as minorities, and some people have asked me this in law enforcement, that same question you just asked. How does that make me feel? It makes me feel bad, but guess what, India? I'm used to it. That's part of my everyday life. I'm used to it
Mm.
because it happens every single day.
Oftentimes when we hear feedback from someone that is in law enforcement, again, it's someone that is already actively in law enforcement. So we rarely hear the stories of those that are no longer in law enforcement and are able to look at the duality of the situation, both being an officer, being a black man, and then now stepping back from both of those and being able to have that perspective. So hearing, you talk about being profiled as a black man because your skin tone is something that you cannot change. How does it feel when members of the community look at you as a enemy because of the badge that you once upheld?
That's par for course as well, because this is a profession that I chose. And one of the reasons, like I said before, I chose it because I wanted to make a difference. In choosing that, I knew the sacrifices. I knew the skepticism. I knew that there'll be a lot of different things. But if we just sit back and worry about and concentrate what everybody else says, then we'll never change. So how does that make me feel? It's par for course. However, what I do is I go into those places. I often, when I talked to you last, I had a seminar at our church where I brought the community and a lot of different police officers together and the mayor, because I want people like me who's been on both sides of the barrel to understand how it feels. So I go to places like Compton. I go to places like Miami. I go to places like the worst of the worst places to allow young kids, minorities, to be able to see me, show them what I've done, show them that they can do this if they in fact choose to,
Mhm.
but let them know that the sacrifices that they're going to have to make as well. So I take it as a challenge. Everybody's not fit or built for law enforcement. Everybody can't be in law enforcement, whether you're black, white, indifferent. Everybody's not fit for that. But I want everybody, minorities, to have an opportunity to see who we are and what we do, because I never saw an FBI agent in India until I was 27 years old when I went to the academy. Never saw FBI badge, didn't even know what it looked like. All I was used to were local cops.
Mhm. And that's what most people are used to seeing. I mean, that's what I've never seen an FBI agent. I can't say I have.
But
But
see one now.
right. But most of my interactions have been with local cops, local police officers. The community's reception right now with police officers is not good.
Yeah.
People are scared, people are angry, people are frustrated, people are tired. What is the message that you would send to a police department, let's say the Wilmington Police Department, that they need to take heed to in order to start establishing a relationship with the community again and rebuilding trust? Or I guess that's where I can start with trust again.
Yeah. So that's the message that we're trying to get across in this General Assembly as well to everybody, police officers, community members, government officials. And that part of building trust is first you got to build a rapport. And part of building a rapport is being able to listen because my experience is not your experience. Go back to what I said before. I never ever wanted to be in law enforcement based on my history with law enforcement. And I've never been in trouble. Yet and still, when I found myself in academies and when I found myself in different law enforcement arenas and different seminars and different places, the dialogue is different. When you hear your counterparts, oh, I've always wanted to be a police officer. My dad was a police officer. My brothers were a police officer. That's not our story. That's not our story. So my talking point, our main point to everybody now is you got to build a rapport first. You got to really listen. You got to understand why blacks don't are not anxious to jump up into law enforcement because we don't trust. We don't trust law enforcement. Yet and still, when you build a rapport, which I was very successful in, not just the black community, white community, Turkish community, Asian community, when you build a rapport, then that's when you get results. And that rapport is always about listening. You can't think that everybody's story is your story, and you got to listen to their frustrations.
Is that why the law enforcement subcommittee was created, to be an ear to listen? Why do you personally think it was created?
It was created to be able to gather everybody's opinions, all stakeholders, law enforcement. If you look at the committee, it's government officials, it's the community. And when I mean the community, I'm not talking about select people that you're talking. I'm talking about people from Riverside. I'm talking about people from Southbridge. I'm talking about people from the North Side. I'm talking about people who really have an input. And it's not just because I told everybody who asked me to be on, I said I don't want to be a figurehead. Don't put me in this thing if this thing doesn't have teeth. I want to make sure that all the stakeholders are going to be heard. I want to make sure that all the people are going to be listened to. And then guess what? Based on your experiences and my experiences and all of our experiences together, that we come up with new legislation, no more chokeholds, which they've already passed the legislation this summer, but other things that we need to really take a serious look at in order to combine the community with the police.
So those that are actually on the committee are elected officials?
No, it's so you have the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force,
Mhm.
and those are all the people that belong to the General Assembly. But then you have four subcommittees, and in those four subcommittees, then you have co-chairs, which I am one. But on those subcommittees, you have across the board people from the Latino community, people from the mosque Muslim community. You have people from the just the community, community. You have lawyers, you have doctors, you have a whole litany of people on these committees.
Mhm. When I was doing my research and looking into the committee, I saw them note names like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and oftentimes when we talk about instances of systemic racism, police brutality, those are the names that come up. Those are some of the names that the force has talked about, fighting for justice for others so that they don't have to go through that. But oftentimes we skip over local names like Jeremy McDowell,
Yeah.
Yaheem Harris, and those individuals. Why do you think that those national stories take precedence over local stories? Do you think that people do not know or that they just don't care?
So people are well aware of our local stories. Those names you just mentioned, people here in Delaware are very aware of, but it is the big national story where the Benjamin Crumps and those people flee to, or they go to, and those are the names that get the prestige. All you have to do is go online. You'll see a litany of names of people that we've never heard before, but they're local people in their local areas. And that fight is just as potent as the national stories.
How was that first meeting that took place among the committee? How was that first meeting, and what were some of the things that were on the agenda that was most pertinent to start to get a move on?
The first meeting went very well. Most of all our meetings are about transparency, open to the public, and it went very well. Some of the takeaways for me was the workforce development, which the committee that I'm on, and that's about recruitment, retention, and hiring. Um, there is, and I've been a part of it in the FBI. As a matter of fact, if you look at CBS yesterday and the day before, they just want to talk about craziness. They just had four, five, six black law enforcement agents, FBI agents on talking about how in 1991 I went into the bureau. In 1991, the FBI was at 5% blacks, Afro Americans. Right now, 30 years later, we're down to 4%, almost 3%, and only 1% black females. Um, and so the hiring is very important because things like, you know, I might take a test that you take a test, and there might be another white male, white female that take a test. They might get an A on it, and we might get a D on it. And it's not the subject matter because a lot of times it's not a specific answer. A lot of times it's very subjective, open-ended questions. And what I've seen and what I've known firsthand, and I've seen this before, is that you and I take the test and we get D's and they get A's, but you and I help them on the test. They had the same answers we did. They just put it a little different way, but they get A's. So again, this is that bias that I'm talking about. So workforce development was important. Transparency and accountability is pertinent. You have to have transparency and you have to have accountability because when a bad apple, a bad officer goes wrong, then you got to be able to speak up. We can't, whatever goes on in this place stays in this place, can't happen.
Why do you think there aren't enough good cops that call out those that do bad things?
Here's the thing, there are. And being a civil rights expert and coordinator for 8 years, what you come to realize is that really in a law enforcement, there is probably about 1% of officers that are bad apples or bad actors,
Can you say
right?
it again?
That are bad actors or bad apples, 1%. But what happens is, and trust me, India, every officer, including command staff, know who the bad apples are. But it's almost whatever goes on in his car stays in his car because you don't want to get a bad rap or whatever. There are people that speak up. There are people that say a lot of different things. I know I was one, but what happens is you have these microaggressions and a lot of things. A lot of times when you make a report on somebody else, it's skipped over. Come Frank, man. Listen, I don't think he's like that, man. His best friend is black. Come on, Frank. I don't think he's like that. I see him hanging out here, but that doesn't stop what he did and what he said.
And a lot of times that can escalate to situations where there is someone's knee on someone's neck or someone is house is being shot through or they're being misidentified as a suspect. Those things escalate. So why wouldn't they take it serious?
You got to remember what I said before. You got to remember who's at the head. You got to remember what the mindset is at the head. The mindset at the head is not our mindset. Remember what I just told you about the FBI being down to 4%? If you go back and you do your research and look at that, the stories that were just on, the people that make the decisions in the FBI and the laws are on the 7th floor of the main headquarters. On that 7th floor, there are no blacks. There are no minorities. And something's wrong. Something's wrong with that. And we've been fighting 30 years to get a voice. And it's not changing. It's actually going backwards. So the problem is not with people stepping up and speaking up. I did a seminar this past June with Matthew Horace, ATF special agent in charge, and Nate McQueen, state police. And it was called The Black and the Blue. And here's the problem, India, the black and the blue. The black and the blue is what you said before. We're not black enough for the brothers when we go back home because we're ops, because we work federally, but we're not blue enough for the badge. You know, we can do whatever, but as far as appointments and advancements and and places of prestige, they fight against that because of what's on the top. So that's the problem, and that's where we got to break through.
So, do you think, even with something like the workforce development, even with bringing in officers that are diverse and of different backgrounds, do you think any of that will matter so long as something like qualified immunity exists?
I know it can matter because I work with the guy who has the model. When you look at President Obama's 24th century policing, task force policing, one of the guys who was the model in there about what we're talking about is a guy named Scott Thompson. And I worked with Scott Thompson over in Camden, New Jersey. He was a police chief. And so what he found out was, and when I worked in Philly, I worked in Camden, which is right across the river, a lot. Camden hated law enforcement, and especially the FBI, but they just hated law enforcement. So what Scott Thompson did was, as the chief, because of this old adage, because of, like I said before, this brand of policing whose narrative has not changed, Scott Thompson, a white male, fired everybody from the entire Camden Police Department, including the command staff and himself. And he made them reapply for their job. But when they reapplied, he took everybody with the old adage and that old attitude and that old systemic racism and implicit bias, and he got rid of them. And he got rid of them. And so he hired those who would be diverse, those who would be open-minded. And I'm telling you, India, that was 2013. The very next year, statistics don't lie. 95% of incidents, calls went down. Crime rate went down some crazy percent. I'm not sure what the percentage is. Murders went down. But what happened was the police now, instead of being guardians or warriors, turned into guardians. And guardian simply meant that we were now able to de-escalate. And that's very important to me because when I first went to the FBI, when you go through the academy, this is what they train you, India. You go to a door, you have your badge, you have your gun, and you knock on the door. FBI, Special Agent Frank Burton, open up the door. Well, guess what? That works well in the academy, but on the street, everybody don't open up the door. On the street, everybody don't respect you. And as a negotiator, what I had to learn was everything I learned in the academy about boom, boom, boom. I had to take a step back and I had to listen to people. And I had to listen to people. Now, think about this. I'm not just talking about a car stop. I'm not just talking about a domestic. Now I'm talking about somebody who has hostages, 3 and 4 and 5 hostages. Now I'm talking about somebody who's ready to jump off of a bridge. I better listen. I gotta listen. And guess what? I'm not in control. I am in control, but they don't know I'm in control. I gotta make them think that they're in control by listening. I have to use active listening skills. I have to use minimal encouragers. I have to use paraphrasing. I have to use effective pauses. All these things that I learned as a negotiator now because I need to listen to you to make sure that you get home safely, to
Do you
make sure that
average police officer needs to employ some of these similar tactics? I mean, we look at instances where situations could have possibly been de-escalated that escalated. Do you think that that would be useful? I mean, when the conversation of abolish the police or defund the police comes up, oftentimes people say, we don't need to abolish them or get rid of them, but we need to reform it. We need to reallocate funds to this area so that they'll be able to have better support, such as bringing on psychiatrists or mental health experts when they go into certain situations. You talked about being a better responder and listener. What would you suggest as the main skill sets or the main things that a police officer needs to have or to bring with them when they respond to crime?
You just hit two of them that I'm fighting for right now in this subcommittee. And the first one is de-escalation skills. I think that every officer needs to have de-escalation training, not just at the beginning of the academy. It needs to be throughout the course of their career, because when you are a first responder, you better know how to listen because you don't know what you're going to roll up on. So that's the first one is de-escalation. There needs to be more training than just one time, as well as what you said before, mental health. Oh my God, I'm fighting for this like crazy, because think about this. This is my 30th year and I'm still active in law enforcement. This is my 30th year in law enforcement. So when I first came into law enforcement, one of the things you got to do, you got to pass a background check, make sure that everything's good. You go and you take a polygraph, make sure everything's good. And then you have to take what's called an MMPI. And an MMPI is nothing but a psychological, you got to go see a psychiatrist, and they have to evaluate whether or not you're fit for duty, right? So during the course of your career, and still today in 30 years, at any time, at any time, you can be subject called in for a drug test, right? You can be called in at any time for a polygraph. But why is it that you only have to take an MMPI once in your career? That's a problem, mental health wise, because here's the problem. What happens, India, if I'm in a law, what happens if I'm in a law enforcement shooting and I shoot somebody? How does that affect me? Do I have night sweats? Do I have nightmares? Do I have PTSD? How does that affect me? What if I get called out and I'm in the military? I'm not in the military, but I'm in the military. We have people in the military, and they get called overseas to do a tour. Well, the FBI, when they came back, we had a reintegration program that they had to come back to Utah. And for 2 weeks, they had to sit down and talk to us, negotiators and psychiatrists, because you want to make sure that everybody's mentally prepared,
Right.
right? So that's the other thing. And the third thing is this: what happens on 9/11, true story, 9/11, when I get called out to go to ground zero, and as I arrive at ground zero, I see people jumping out of high story buildings, and you see people splattering to the ground, and you hear sounds, and you smell the stench, and you see all of that. So guess what? So how does that affect me mentally? Has anybody ever checked on me ever again? I only had to do one MMPI. I think that it should be not only when you have incidents, but also randomly. Just check to see how you, because I don't want to go out with you, India, on the street if you got some kind of problem, some issue where you can't do what you need to do, which jeopardizes me and you. So
Right.
that's one thing that I'm fighting for, as well as, and I know Smyrna Police has this. They have a on-call mental health person that's always on call. That if in fact that an officer goes up, a first responder, like we saw on the news recently, where the guy was naked and something mentally was wrong with him, and the police officers did some crazy stuff to them because they didn't know how to handle a mentally challenged person. You got to have all those things in place. That's what I'm
Mhm.
fighting for.
Yeah, I think mental health is definitely a very important topic that I believe that more people are bringing attention to now, because like you said, it's not only a police officer that sees a lot on a regular basis whose mind is being affected, but it's also a person who may live in a neighborhood and they are affected by post-traumatic stress disorder because of the violence that they may see in their communities that are not talked about. There's so much going on there's so much that I think that, again, if people did take the time to listen to someone like you, come to the conversations that you have, I think that we'd be better off. We get a little bit further ahead.
Yeah, yeah. And in India, the other thing too, behind that, we talk about the extremes, right? There is a history in law enforcement that it has the highest divorce and alcoholism rate.
Mm,
Why? Because we deal with the same things everybody else does: relationship problems, divorce, kids going awry, the whole nine. But
sure.
where do we get help? So I was also an EAP rep for the FBI as well, employee assistance program rep. I wasn't a licensed psychologist, but people came to me to talk about their problems to make sure that they could mentally get some things off that they needed to get off. We need more of that as well.
We need mental health help all around the board. So, for the workforce development program, talk to me about what are the qualifications for someone to be a part of it and also to move forward if they wanted to in law enforcement.
Yeah, the qualifications for being part of the task force and what we're doing is simple. You and it was out back in June that if you want to be a part of this, you simply write in an email, an email to leo.gov.generalassembly.gov. You write that in. You tell them that you want to be a part of this. Whether you, it didn't matter if you were a part of the community. It didn't matter if you were a professional or whatever. And so the law enforcement um, accountability task force, what they did was they vetted all of those things, and they put those different people who wanted to be a part of this process on different subcommittees. Now, as far as being in law enforcement, if you want to go forward and you want to be in law enforcement, there are so many different people that you can talk to, including myself. The chair of this whole committee, Franklin Cook, is a 30-year retired county cop, an excellent person to talk to, from Newcastle, from Garfield Park, Simon's Garden, that whole area over there. He's excellent. He's embedded in the community. Sometimes it's just about talking to people and finding out. And if that's not what you want to do, you don't have to do it. There are advantages, but there are a lot of sacrifices that you have to make. But there's some definite advantages as well.
What are some things that would stop someone from being accepted into something like this? What would be the no, we can accept you types of things?
Right. Naturally, it would be the background. You would have to make sure that your background was secure. And it's a little bit different than when I first came in. When I first came in 30 years ago, you had to be squeaky clean. You couldn't have used drugs. You couldn't have anything on your record, but you couldn't have tattoos. You couldn't have earrings. But society is changing, and that's a little bit different. And they've minimized those standards, which is appropriate because everybody's not perfect. But also, you got to be able to pass a regular standardized test. So you got to pass a test, you got to pass a background, you got to be physically fit in order to pass the physical fit requirements as well.
So again, what exactly does the Delaware Law Enforcement Accountability Subcommittee overlook?
So the law enforcement accountability task force is the overseeing body, which is broken down into four subcommittees, and those subcommittees are use of force, it is workforce development, it is transparency and accountability, and it is community policing and engagement. So all four of those different spectrums we're looking at. And what the goal is to report to the 151st General Assembly sometime maybe next year, about different recommendations, and the governor and other police departments, recommendations that we submit to the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force to be able to create new legislation about some of the things that we already talked about: mental health, body cams, which we already passed, as well as some of the other things that we talked about. So we're opening it up for everybody to be able to submit suggestions so we can talk about it, have an open dialogue, just like you and I are talking, to see what we want to enact into law.
So it is that easy to actually ask or to submit to be a part of the one of the committees by just sending an email.
Yeah, well, and that was earlier. Most of the committees are in place. However, this is about transparency and accountability. So every hearing that we have, every meeting that we have is open to the public, and the public can call in for general comment, or they can be a part of it and dial in for general comment, or they can also send an email about the questions that they have.
So you're no longer accepting anyone to submit. So that means, let's say there is a family member of someone who has lost a loved one to police brutality. They would not be able to join this at this time.
Well, not just that, a lot of family members, including the ones you're talking about, have been considered and are on our task force. But anybody coming in right now, that was back in June.
Mhm.
So they started talking about this back in June, and I think the committees were solidified by August. So the subcommittees are solidified now. It's up to the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force if, in fact, they want to add somebody else.
What can people look forward to in the coming months that you are working on that has to do with community engagement or community and police engagement? Is there anything happening coming up?
Yeah, we have meetings every month of those four subcommittees, and it's on the Delaware General Assembly website. You can always look and find out. It's on the public calendar when we're going to be talking about different issues and presenting different things that we're talking about now. The public can always chime in. They can always be in on the Zoom call, and they can always add public comment. They can add suggestions as well, because what we want is for everybody, and I mean everybody, stakeholders, to have a part in this so we can make legislation, you know, true.
Thank you so much, Mr. Burton, for coming on and having this conversation. I think it was very informative, and a lot of people will be able to take a lot from it.
Thank you, India. I appreciate it.
And thank you for all of you for watching Up with India. Again, you guys can always check me out here on WITN 22 Wilm at WITN 22 Wilm. But don't go anywhere because we have another conversation coming up next.